welcome to the sixth episode of my podcast, The Never-Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about food. It is such a big topic, but I've been a little obsessed with food since I was around 11, and so I wanted to go over some of what I've learned about food and diets. There is so much information out there and so many trends. I think it's one of the trendiest areas of life, maybe next to fashion, is food and what kind of foods go in and out of favor, which is kind of funny because most people have strong preferences when it comes to food. So, my learning about food came from when I was quite young. I was around 10 years old when I started questioning why we were eating meat. So I was raised in the prairies, and I have a lot of relatives who live on farms and ranches. So I was very familiar with the ranching and beef industry. I moved to Calgary when I was 8, and steak culture, beef culture is very, very big in Calgary and throughout the whole prairies. So I enjoyed steak when I was young. We ate a lot of meat. I wasn't as into pork. I remember we had like pork chops and that kind of thing. I had a very standard North American diet when I was a child. And when it was just with my dad, when he was a single dad, we did go out to eat a lot, mostly at Smitty's, breakfast foods. We had a lot of that, a lot of omelets. And after that, it was maybe a little more traditional, a little less processed foods, but we still did eat quite a lot of processed foods, Lipton noodle soup, Kraft dinner, that kind of thing. As I got older, I started questioning the diet more, and I just became really disgusted by killing animals. And I also read Diet for a New America by John Robbins, which is a critique of the mostly the meat processing in the slaughterhouses and the way that they treat animals in factory farms. So I mean, my view hasn't changed on that at all over the years. I still think factory farming is really terrible, and the industrialization of our food in general, I think, is really negatively influenced us, and it's negatively influenced the environment. And I think also culturally, it has dissociated us from the source of our food because food is really a very intimate thing. And if we looked at traditional cultures, usually you were fairly involved in the selection of your food. You would probably learn to go and either work in the fields or pick berries or forage from the natural environment and hunt and keep animals which were close to you. And that was the case only around a century ago, that most people had farm animals. A lot of people had chickens in their backyard. Pretty much everybody had a dog and some cat. I still agree strongly that the Industrial Revolution has been a big negative for our food supply, and it has taken us out of our ecosystem because we're animals first and foremost, and we can't change that. So our role, and we do have a role in the environment, which potentially, I believe, if we did it right, could actually be very positive for other animals because we have knowledge and we have our nimble hands that are able to create things and do things that a lot of other animals with, paws and claws can't necessarily do. So unfortunately, we've used those skills against other animals and against the ecosystem in general. So I am a believer in whole foods and nutrition, but I think that it really has been a dramatic shift in how the health food world has changed as well. So if we go back in time to when I was 10 or 11 and I started to become vegetarian and my stepmom got more involved in health food. So we shifted the diet of the whole family away from highly processed foods and looked more towards health food and supplements. And even at that time, there really was not a lot of organic produce, not a lot of certification, not a lot of people doing it, but there was a slow shift. And when you went to the health food store, it was usually a few organic items maybe, and then most of it was in transition. So there was a whole bunch of farmers that all at once in the 90s realized that this highly processed pesticide and artificial fertilizer food was actually having a really negative influence on their own health and the health of everyone else. And so there was a shift towards organic farming. Now, although that organic farming has definitely increased a lot since then, unfortunately, the industrial agriculture has also increased. And they've come up with new poisons and new ways of interfering with nature, unfortunately. So, although we kind of have progress in both directions, I guess you could say. But the long-term effects of that artificial and industrial agriculture, I think, is showing itself even more clearly now. And we are definitely in a time where food shortages are becoming more real. For the first time in my life, I know that there has been real food shortages in Canada. It used to be that if you couldn't afford food, you could go to the food bank. And then this year, the food bank, they've been actually running out of food in some places. So it's all because of overpopulation, and that's something that I talk a lot about, and I know it's very controversial. Because let's face it, kids need to eat, we all need to eat. It's incredible when you think about how much we all eat. In a single day, the costs have gone up, the availability has gone down, and the availability of work in order to get that money to buy that food has also gone down. So food security has become a real issue. We're looking at the possibility that the food networks that we currently have using globalized economics could collapse very easily. It's just become hard to survive. And Canada has always been a hard place to survive. That's why the original population was much lower than, say, in Mexico, where it's warm and they have this wonderful volcanic soil that's very good for agriculture and a long agricultural tradition and a long tradition of cities. Whereas in Canada, there really were no cities like we have today. So food is absolutely required in order to create a city in the first place. And so what happens with these systems is that there's all of the farmers around a city that provide food for the people living in the city since they don't have enough room to grow their own food. Although in the past, there would have been probably more food growth in the city than there is now. Although, of course, it's making a comeback, and I do want to be part of that comeback. So, what's happening now in Canada, and what my housemate has been involved with, is part of sustainable food security. And they're working on creating these greenhouse systems and permaculture and all those kind of things, regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of different overlapping concepts, but it really is all about being organic, staying away from poison and from artificial contaminants into the environment, and being able to grow your own food and grow food for the people around you. Now, there's still a lot of economic blocks to making that a reality, but I think the more people that get involved with it, the better prepared we are to move into the future and be able to sustain ourselves without relying on food coming from halfway across the world, which is really what we're doing now. And there are a lot of items that I would love to eat, and I think that sometimes you just have to accept that it's not growing in your area. I think the best way to, say, get avocados and bananas here in Canada may not be to just import all of them from further south, but actually start working more on these greenhouse systems and more on actually working with the plants themselves. Because there's a lot of different plants that can be bred to withstand different climates. Now, that's very different than genetic modification. And I've always been against the genetic modification of organisms. And that's really for the reason that our life impulse is spontaneously created from our own cells. So it comes from within our own cells. So when you're a little zygote, when your parents' sperm and egg came together, that was a spontaneous event, unless you're IVF or surrogacy, in which case it was not. But for all of life, that's really how evolution goes. So I believe that when we interfere in that process, we are damaging life itself. So it isn't even a matter of like what the environmental impacts of genetic modified organisms is or what the health impacts are. Those things are very important. But from a very basic philosophical and biological framework, and from understanding that evolution is real, when you interfere with that spontaneous creation of new life, you are attacking life. So I believe that genetically modified organisms are an attack on life itself. And they are an attack on that self-created, spontaneous evolution. And so attacking life itself in order to feed life is incredibly backwards. So I am strongly opposed to all genetically modified organisms. I don't believe that we should ever be interfering in the genetics of a new life form. And that's because life does it better, and we will never do it better. The best that we can do is to follow life and to follow nature, to follow those patterns that we already know exist, to observe them better, and to make the best of that, rather than trying to redo what nature is already doing just fine. We have so many cultures that for millions of years have co-evolved with these plant foods and brought us so many of these foods that we enjoy today: corn, wheat, tomatoes. I mean, there's so many foods that have been, artificially selected from naturally wild plants in order to make them more abundant in the part of the plant that we consume. So wild wheat may have harder seeds and they may be smaller because that is what works for the plant. And then when we get involved, we start to make those grains softer and bigger so that we can eat them easier and there's more food for us to consume. So that's the kind of things that we do when we start to get involved in the evolution of plants. But that does help us, and I think the main thing is that we also go back and we crossbreed with the wild organisms again, so that those organisms can have their ability to protect themselves and thrive. So the more that we take from those plants, and if we keep selecting them only for the traits that we want, we may actually be taking away their own traits that they need to survive. Now, this kind of manipulation of evolution happens in a lot of different ways, and we generally call it domestication. Domestication of animals also makes them softer and weaker and easier to deal with. We tend to only domesticate animals that have a calm enough nature and a sociable nature so that we can interact with them positively. And so we don't see a lot of domesticated reptiles because they're a little too wild for us, and they don't have as much of that social intelligence that animals like cats and dogs have, which they have a very strong social intelligence. I would say dogs have a superior social intelligence compared to us. And there's also the theory, which I think is very interesting, that in fact our own domestication, our own evolution as human beings came out of our interaction with wolves and dogs. So it wasn't so much that we domesticated dogs as that dogs also domesticated us. And that's because we are primates. And what we're good at is manipulation. And that's exactly why we get into so much trouble. We are the little monkeys that like to play around with things. And again, there are no domesticated monkeys either. We don't have that because monkeys are so intelligent and cunning. And they do have complicated social networks, but their skill, like us, is really cleverness. And cleverness and social intelligence are two different kinds of intelligence. And so I think as human beings, we have to acknowledge where we are not as good, and while at the same time using those skills that we do have, which is tool making. And it's been suggested that perhaps we even change the name of our species from Homo sapiens. I would change it to Homo habilis, which is basically the tool maker, humans, the tool makers, because that's what we've excelled at. We are not wise. Sapiens is very, very unworthy of most human beings today. So in Canada, the greenhouse movement is definitely gaining momentum. We're seeing lots of interesting types of greenhouses, and I am working on a greenhouse on the side of my house, which is part of the Earthship style of building a house. Now, this house is already old, and so we're adding on to it. We're adding that south-facing greenhouse, which we're hoping to actually put in raised beds within it. And hopefully we can keep foods growing all winter long that we can use, or at least keep them alive, keep some of those perennials alive. When I was 12, then I started a vegetarian diet, and I did not do it right. I eliminated a lot of the meat that I was eating, but I did it slowly. I still ate chicken, and then I still ate a little bit of fish, and I just wasn't used to eating vegetables. So eating vegetables was really something that I had to learn because we didn't have a lot of it. We had potatoes, you know, cooked peas. I hated cooked peas. I hated the beans that we had. I hated those beans out of a can. I was really picky, and I think that a part of it is that we didn't really know how to prepare them right. I think in some of the sort of Euro-Western culture, there was just sort of like a blandness. We never really learned to use spices very well. And, it's funny in Canada because even though we have so much French, I don't know anything about French cuisine. I watch it on television. I've learned all of it just from watching cooking shows, but French cuisine didn't survive in Canada hardly at all. French Canadian cuisine is a little different. Pea soup is very common. I love the split pea soup. I love that, the habitant pea soup. And of course, maple syrup, which was indigenous, and that was collected by native people before the French showed up. So that history with Canadian food, it never really became anything particularly distinct, especially for Canada as a whole. Instead, I think Canadian cuisine is mostly known for sort of let's say the macro items, like the big meat, like if you want to look at what the indigenous people were eating, like deer and elk and bison and salmon and trout and all of these different kinds of fish from the lakes. So it was very meat heavy, and there's, of course, berries and herbs and things like that. But mostly what they're known for is meat. So that was hard for me. I became vegetarian, and then I'm living in a place where it's very, very meat oriented. And that just makes sense because it's a very cold climate. And the fact is that if you don't have plants growing for half the year, you certainly can't rely on them to only eat that kind of food. So the plant-based movement now, I think the idea that it's going to sort of save the world, I don't really buy that. But I do think plant-based in general is better for your health. But I think what we're seeing now is a lot of people are finding that because we are an omnivorous species, so our ancestry are all people who ate both meat and vegetables. So we can't really say that we're meant to eat a certain diet because the whole reason why we live all over the world is because we learn to process our food. So cooking and drying and smoking, those kinds of preservation techniques are what has allowed us to expand into so many different ecosystems because we learned to take the foods that were there, to cultivate them and to preserve them so that in times of scarcity we still have some extra food left over. Now, for my upbringing in Saskatchewan, of course, I got to see a bit of that lifestyle, the homesteading lifestyle. So that's more of the settler version of being self-sufficient and having your own mini ecosystem. And the main difference between that and the indigenous lifestyle is really that the settlers brought so many of their own foods to cultivate in sort of like a mini bubble. And a lot of these old homesteads, you can see the caragana bushes, which are these really big bushes, those are imported. So they're not native and they provide shelter for these little gardens that were grown and all kinds of vegetables, and of course, a huge canning process that would happen after harvest, when you get all your vegetables and you make sure that you can preserve enough of them throughout the winter. So, a lot of people now, of course, are living a lifestyle that's a mix of that, and of course, lots of availability at the grocery store, or at least there was up until a couple years ago. So, my philosophy now on food is really a lot about self observation. And I think that goes against a lot of what I'm seeing with the trends in food. So, trends like, suddenly the acai berry is like the best superfood around and everyone should be eating acai, or seaweed, or there's always like a new fad or a new kind of food. And I think what's so dangerous about those food trends is that they push everyone to try the same thing all at once. And that's not something that farmers can keep up with. They can't necessarily predict that next year everyone is going to be watching this show and suddenly almonds are the best thing in the world. Well, they didn't grow enough almonds for all those people to eat them. So that creates a food shortage of that particular item. So I think that it's pretty silly to get so caught up in one food. Yes, there are a lot of superfoods out there, but that doesn't mean that the regular foods are bad. I guess that's a thing. Like when you try a diet, you really have to observe yourself. Self observation is really the way to figure out if it's working or not for you. And I think too many people just follow a diet and don't look at what it's really doing to them. I think that the idea that there's one kind of healthy diet is pretty silly. Like there's just so many different foods that we have learned to eat. So I think looking at your own ancestry and looking at what's growing around you are the two most important aspects of food to take into account. Back when I was young, so what I did is that I learned to cook on my own when I was around 12, 13. I think it was my neighbor that gave me two books by Molly Katzen, Moosewood Cookbook and The Enchanted Broccoli Forest. And I cooked almost every recipe in both of those books. They're really great books. I highly recommend them. And I think they really saved my life because I became anemic and I was really thin and I wasn't eating enough. And when I stopped eating meat, I didn't really start eating more vegetables and I didn't start eating more legumes. All I remembered was those nasty mushy peas and the horrible sauce and the white beans that come out of a can and the kidney beans and the bean salad and all of those things. I just didn't like the taste of any of it. And then when I started trying other foods, I found chickpeas and lentils and adzuki beans and pinto beans. And suddenly I realized that there's a lot of legumes out there that are really yummy. And I just didn't know how to prepare them properly. So trying different ethnic foods like Mediterranean food and Asian food. And I tried a lot of the macrobiotics. And the macrobiotics is pretty similar to my philosophy. But of course, the recipes in those books are usually Japanese because that's where that philosophy originated. But actually, if you really follow the philosophy, then they recommend to eat the food from your own area. So it doesn't. If you're not living in Japan, then they don't necessarily recommend that you just eat Japanese food. But there are a lot of positive things in Japanese food. Like seaweed is one of them, and seaweed is really good. But I think you have to be careful of jumping on one big thing that's going to like change your life and you're like, "Oh, I'm eating this and now everything's better." Like maybe that is the case for you, but it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. So I know there was a lot of fear about gluten. A lot of people have gone gluten-free. I tried going without bread for a while just to see, and I just ended up hungry. And I never felt better at all. I just was honestly, I think bread just filled up a little bit for my appetite that works for me, and I didn't feel any positives from quitting bread. So I just decided, I'm gonna stick with the kind of bread that works for me. And I think a lot of times too, like if you get stomach aches or things like that, you kind of have to pay attention to what foods are doing that to you. And to remember, I think a lot of times people just shut off to listening to their own health and to your own body because it's giving you clues all the time. And they may not be easy to interpret. And I know I've had physical issues that take me a long time to figure out. But when it comes to food, you just have to pay attention to how you feel after. And usually, if you're eating junk food and eating only at restaurants for a while, like when you're traveling, you'll start to feel it just, you're a little more tired and like maybe your nails are cracking more or things like that. And, I do think vitamins are very helpful. I think that it is true, and they have done a lot of studies about the agricultural industry and that they do deplete a lot of those foods from nutrients, especially when you're giving artificial fertilizers, because nature provides so much more diversity in the type of fertilizer that you get from an organic compost, or from different kinds of minerals and things like that. So soil health is really, really important to making sure that our vegetables are very nutritious. So I think taking vitamins is a good idea, and you just have to, ask your doctor for a blood test to see what your vitamin levels are. I don't think you can just go around and tell people what vitamins they should have exactly. And I think also if you switch up your multivitamin, then you know that you're getting different amounts rather than stick with the same one. Because our bodies are so complicated. I know the last few times that my doctor has told me I'm low in something, it's always something different. It's not the same thing. So that means that, your diet, if you shift it a little bit one way, sometimes you may deplete it from something else. So it just takes a lot of knowledge and awareness and to, watch your own health and see how you feel. Because I don't believe that anybody is really meant to have the exact same diet as anybody else. So for me, what I ended up doing is after 12 years of being vegetarian, and towards the end, too, like I did start eating a bit of meat. I would usually have one salmon dinner like every year. So after 12 years, I finally started eating meat again. And one of my doctors said, he was actually in a vegetarian society for some time. And he said, with what your condition is, it might be better if you do eat some meat. And so I did start eating meat throughout my 20s. And by the time I was 30, I looked at a picture of myself and I realized I was gaining a lot of weight. And so I realized, I was overdoing it. And I actually started eating too much meat, too much dairy. And just through experimenting and changing my diet a little bit here and there, what I realized is that just a little bit of meat for me works just great so that it is like a long-term energy source. But because it's so dense in calories, I feel that too much meat is really, really negative for me. But none at all is also negative. So that's what I've determined, and that's why I really think that everybody should observe themselves and figure out their own diet by taking foods out and trying new foods and mixing it around a little bit, especially if you have health issues. I think for most people that are generally healthy, don't even really think about it that much. But most of us have ups and downs, and a lot of that time they can be related to the kinds of food that you're eating. So for me now, the biggest thing that was challenging for me is dairy. And it's sad because I love dairy. And even when I was a vegetarian, I ate a lot of dairy, a lot of eggs. And I still eat eggs. I haven't really found a lot of negatives for eggs. But I do try to avoid dairy, not completely. And because we eat so much, 3 meals a day, usually, ideally, because we eat so much, it's like it just makes sense that we're going to eat a mixed diet and we can sort of take from a lot of different food sources. And eating locally isn't just about health, It's also about the economics. It's about keeping your own community afloat and keeping the people around you employed. My hope is to now create a permaculture garden in my yard. And we have plans now, and it's just a matter of figuring out what's going to grow where. And it's an ongoing project, but it is very exciting. And there's nothing better than being able to just go out into your own garden instead of having to go grocery shopping and just come inside with your groceries already there. You've already grown them yourself, or the plants grew them. They grew them for you. So I hope that more people are able to have their own yards if they want to grow food. I know there is a big push to urbanize and industrialize and get everybody living in tight, cramped spaces so that we can be an overpopulated hive species. But I think what we are really and what we desire is to be integrated into the ecosystem. That's certainly what I want. And I've never been so happy than to have my own yard. And the challenge is just to get those plans together and know where to put what. And you have to look at all the complications like sun and rain and pests and companions and all those different things and what you like to eat and what works well for your body. So it is complicated and it is a lot of learning, but I'm kind of obsessed with it now and it's become a really big part of my life. And one of my biggest desires is to try new varieties of hybridized vegetables and herbs so that, maybe there's going to be a new kind of pepper. We'll see. I've planted a cayenne pepper next to a Pasilia pepper, and we're going to be saving some of those seeds and see if next year maybe we'll plant some that have some of the qualities of two different kinds of peppers. And that's just something farmers have done forever, and it's so fun to do. It's so interesting, and it helps us to learn about genetics because we're all DNA organisms. We have that in common. And pure breeding and domestication have some serious downfalls. So we have to be able to balance those things out with the ability to feed ourselves and the ability to be, advanced with our technology while at the same time not getting swallowed up with technology and not expecting technology to solve our problems because a lot of our problems were caused by technology. And I truly believe that nature has the answers. We are all a part of nature and we need to integrate ourselves into that. And then if we get more connected to that, then we are more likely to be able to feed ourselves and feed everyone around us well into the future. Thanks for listening in, and I will see you again in a couple weeks. Thank you.